Back when I was in high school, I had a good group of friends. We lived in a small town, so people from my area were really close. We went to the high school in a slightly larger town, though, and there were a lot of people who I didn't really know. One of my best friends was Jake, and he lived on a farm with his parents. They had some cash crops as well as a smaller organic farm that his mom maintained. There were some animals, but it was mainly just chickens that they used for eggs, not industrial scale or anything. Jake threw a party at his family's farm one weekend, while his parents were out of town. It was far enough out that no one worried about noise complaints. Jake liked that kind of freedom, and so did we. We put the word out at school for the whole week prior, so there would be a good turnout. Since there was so much space, he was cool with anybody coming. I went over early in the evening to help with some things. Jake wanted to make sure nobody went in the house, and that everyone stayed away from the chickens and his mom's garden. We put up some temporary fences that they had lying around, just so people would know. As it got a little later, it seemed that the whole school showed up that night. People brought their own drinks, and someone set up a speaker system. Before long, the music was blasting loud enough to hear from the edge of the property. That was fine, though, because the neighbors were even farther than that. It was one of those parties where you didn't really know how many people would come, but as the hours went by, it just kept growing. By around 10 p.m., there were at least 100 people there. I hung out with a few of my close friends, mostly sitting on the tailgate of a truck, watching the chaos unfold. There were people dancing near the barn, and someone had started a bonfire a little farther out. Every once in a while, Jake would pass by to make sure everything was going smoothly, though it was clear things were starting to get out of hand. Some people were already stumbling around obviously drunk, and I noticed a few guys wrestling in the grass. But for the most part, no one seemed worried. It was just another high school party, and everyone figured it would all blow over by morning. I didn't think too much about it either. It was just fun, and we were all soaking it up while we could. It was a dark night, so it was really hard to tell who everyone was. There was a fire, but other than that, just a few small lights on the side of the barn. At some point, I noticed a group of guys that I didn't recognize. They weren't from our school, and something about them made me worried. They were hanging around the edge of the field, standing by a car that had its lights on. I got up and walked a little closer. The light from the car shined on their faces, and I could see that they looked a little older than most of us. I kept an eye on them for a minute, but then I let it go. Even if they were some randoms that showed up, then it would probably be fine. They were just hanging out and keeping to themselves, but they stood apart from everyone else. They didn't join the party or talk to anyone else, which felt strange. It was like they were just waiting for something. I tried to ignore it and kept talking with my friends, but every now and then, I'd glance back and see them. They were just hanging back, watching everyone around the fire. A little later, things started to take a turn. I was standing around by the barn with a group of people, and there was another group around the fire, which wasn't that far away. One of the guys from that group around the car came over to the fire and got into an argument with a kid from our school named Mark. I didn't know the kid very well. He was a junior and I was a senior, so we didn't have any classes together, but I'd seen him around. At first it didn't seem like a big deal. People argue at parties all the time, but this was different. The argument got heated fast, and it wasn't the usual back and forth you'd expect over something stupid, like a spilled drink or a dumb comment. It felt tense. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told the whole story. Mark was getting defensive, and the guy from the group seemed to be pushing him around. A crowd started to form around them, which usually makes things worse, and people were egging them on instead of trying to break it up. Jake was over with me, and to be honest, he'd had a little too much to drink, so he wasn't keeping things under control. I walked over to get a better view of everything. There were people blocking my view from where I was. When I got past the crowd, I saw the older guy push Mark into the fire. He stumbled through it, and it didn't look like he was hurt. I tried to get over there to help, but I was blocked by the crowd of yahoos that were cheering it on. Then I poked my head over and got a good view of what was happening. The older guy suddenly pulled out a gun. It happened so fast that no one really understood what was going on until the shot went off. The sound cut through the music, and everything just stopped for a second. Mark collapsed, grabbing at his chest where the bullet hit. Then all hell broke loose. As soon as the shot rang out, everyone started screaming and running in every direction. People were tripping over themselves to get away. They were pushing and shoving, trying to make it out of the field. I was almost knocked over a few times, but managed to stand my ground. It didn't feel real. The guys from that group around the car drove off. Jake and a couple of others ran over to him trying to help, but it was bad. Someone finally called 911, but by then, I wasn't sure what was going to happen. The cops and paramedics showed up surprisingly quickly, probably because someone reported hearing gunshots in the area. After that, the party was over, obviously. People were too shocked to say much, and most of us just left without looking back. The cops interviewed a few people, but no one seemed to know who the guys were or why they had come to the party in the first place. The next week at school, everyone was talking about it, but it wasn't the same kind of gossip you'd normally hear after a party. People were shaken. Jake was messed up about it too, knowing it happened at his place. Surprisingly, Mark survived and made a recovery. It turned out that he knew the guy who shot him, so he was able to rat him out to the police. They arrested the guy and his friends for what they did that night, and 2 of them actually did time for it. It was one of the worst crimes to happen in our area, and nothing has come close since. One night last month, I went out with some friends. I live in a small town, and my buddy Dan lives in the next town over. The bar we went to was really more of a truck stop off the side of the highway, but it wasn't that far from Dan's house. Since we were both drinking, we decided not to drive. It was only a 45-minute walk along the country roads, so we decided to do that. After we were ready to call it a night, it was around 1 a.m. We didn't get up to anything too crazy, and the both of us just had a couple of drinks. Dan's area was pretty isolated, and there was not much street lighting. We had been walking down the road for about 10 minutes, and hadn't seen a car pass since. The road we were walking on didn't have much of a shoulder, so we stuck to the side, staying out of the way in case a car came by. There was about 3 feet of grass on the side, then it dipped down steeply into the ditch. The stars and the moon were bright enough that we could see where we were going, and the road itself was just a straight shot to Dan's house. We were both a little buzzed but not drunk, so we were walking fine and still having a good time, just enjoying the night. Then I heard something. It was a car coming up fast behind us. I turned my head to look down the road, but it was too dark to see anything other than a pair of bright white headlights. The sound of the engine kept getting louder, and it didn't sound like whoever was driving was slowing down at all. Dan and I moved a little closer to the ditch, just to be safe. It was coming in way too fast for this kind of road, especially with the curves up ahead. We kept walking, but I felt myself start to get tense as the car came closer. I turned around just in time to see headlights swerving all over the road. It was heading straight for us. It wasn't like the driver had lost control for a second. They were weaving back and forth in a way that made me think they were drunk. Without even thinking, I grabbed Dan's arm and yanked him hard toward the ditch. We both jumped off the road, just as the car sped past. It missed us by only a few feet. I could feel the rush of air from it as it passed. It was that close. We hit the ground hard, tumbling into the ditch in a mess of dirt and grass. I landed awkwardly on my side, and Dan rolled over a few feet away from me. He rolled into the shallow puddle at the bottom of the ditch, and it made a squishy splash. The car didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. I sat up and looked at Dan, who was brushing dirt and mud off his jacket. Neither of us said anything for a moment. We were both too shocked at what had just happened. I glanced down the road, but the car was already gone. "Did that really just happen?" Dan finally said, shaking his head. I nodded. It took another few seconds for it to sink in, just how close we had come to getting hit. A few more seconds, or if we hadn't jumped when we did, then we would have been right in the path of that car. After catching our breath and making sure we were both okay, we climbed back up onto the road. I looked back one more time, but there was no sign of the car. There wasn't much else we could do but keep walking. We discussed calling the cops, but neither of us wanted to deal with it. It was most likely a drunk driver, so it would have been best to call, but we didn't. We started heading toward Dan's place again, this time keeping to the far edge of the road just in case. We didn't talk much for the next few minutes. I think we were both still a little shaken up from how close we'd come to being hit. We kept walking for about 20 minutes, and then something caught my eye up ahead. It was hard to make out at first, but as we got closer, I could see a set of red tail lights off to the side of the road. I thought it was a car in the ditch, and as we got closer, that is exactly what it was. It didn't take long for me to recognize it. It was the same car that had almost run us over. The headlights were still on, and the car was tilted at an awkward angle. We walked up to the car cautiously, and when I peered inside, I saw someone slumped over in the driver's seat. The guy was passed out, with his head resting on the steering wheel. He didn't seem hurt. just unconscious. We didn't hesitate this time. Dan pulled out his phone and called the cops. They checked on the guy, who woke up pretty confused, but he didn't seem hurt. We watched from a distance as the cops handled it. I don't know what they were saying exactly, but it was probably just standard stuff. They arrested him for drunk driving on the spot. We were both relieved the guy hadn't hurt anyone else, but I couldn't stop thinking about how close we'd come to being hit. It probably wasn't the smartest thing for us to be walking on a rural road in the middle of the night. We both knew that there were drunk drivers out there, so we were playing a dangerous game. It could have ended a lot worse for us, but we were lucky that night. My wife and I were still living in the city until a few years ago. We had a townhouse, and we were both commuting almost an hour to work. However, my work switched to online when the pandemic hit. I thought it would just be temporary, but I soon found out that it was permanent. My company even got rid of the office completely. Because of that, we decided to move out to the country. My wife was pregnant at the time, and she was planning to leave her job anyway. We settled on a rural town only a few hours from where we were living before. That way we wouldn't be too far away from family and friends. One weekend, my wife Jessica was visiting her family, so I had the house to myself. The property was surrounded by trees, and there was a small pond just a short walk from the house on our property. That weekend, I invited my friends Alex and Drew to come over and hang out. They arrived Friday night, and we had dinner, then sat around a fire pit I had set up in the backyard. The weather was cool that night, and the fire was nice. There was only one neighbor nearby, a guy named Grant, who lived just down the road. He was an older guy, probably in his 50s, and from the few times I'd seen him, I could tell he wasn't the friendliest. We didn't get along that well at all. I'd had a couple of run-ins with him before, mostly about noise, but nothing serious. I hadn't thought much of him until that night. The fire was going strong, and we were enjoying the night when I noticed Grant walking toward us from the direction of his house. When he got close, I could tell that he didn't look happy, but that was normal for him. He walked straight up to us with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. I introduced him to Alex and Drew, but he barely glanced at them. His eyes were fixed on me, and he looked really angry. "You're being too loud," he said. At first, I didn't even know what he was talking about. We didn't even have any music going, and we were just talking normally. His house was a good 100 feet away anyway, so I was surprised he even heard us at all. He then leaned in closer to me and said, "You don't know what kind of trouble you can get into out here." His voice dropped even lower, and it felt like a threat. My friends looked really uncomfortable too, and I certainly felt the same. Drew stood up and tried to calm things down. "Hey man, we're just hanging out, no harm done," he said, but Grant didn't even look at him. He kept his focus on me and ignored everything else. "You ever think about how people go missing in these woods?" Grant asked. "How no one would hear you if you needed help." I could feel the tension rising. Grant was trying to scare us, and it was working. I didn't know if he was bluffing, or if he actually planned to do something, but either way, I wasn't about to let him hang around any longer. I stood up, looked him in the eye, and told him he needed to leave. He stared at me for a moment, then smirked like he knew something I didn't, before turning and walking back toward his house. After Grant left, we all felt weird, but not enough to ruin the night. We hung out for a while longer, but Alex and Drew decided to call it a night, so we said our goodbyes and they drove off. I was glad to be heading inside where it was warm, but I was somewhat worried about that neighbor of mine. About 10 minutes after they left, I looked out the back window and saw something moving outside. I could see the outline of a person walking around the yard. At first I thought one of the guys had forgotten something and came back. I turned on the patio lights and stepped outside to help. However, as soon as I got a good look at the person, I realized that it wasn't my friends, it was Grant. I still wasn't scared, and part of me wanted to smooth things over with him. It was a little creepy that he had snuck over to my property, but I was still prepared to let that go. However, before I could say anything, I saw he had a gun. In no time, he started yelling at me. His words were a mess that made little sense. Some of it was about the noise earlier, and some of it was just rambling. I backed away, and once I was back in the house, I locked the door and called the police. It felt like forever before they showed up, but eventually they did. Grant was still out there, pacing around with the gun out. He was still yelling even though I had gone inside. The officers arrested him without much resistance. After that, I didn't see Grant again. The cops told me he had some kind of history, though they didn't go into details. Whether it was a criminal history or just drugs, I don't know. About 2 months later, Grant's house was for sale. It was sold to a young couple around our age. We ended up becoming friends, and eventually, I told them about Grant. They seemed surprised because they told me that they bought the house from an old woman's estate who had passed away. Maybe Grant was related to her, and it was no big deal, but the timing was really suspicious. I think there may have been more going on than I realized, but the details have never come out. My best friend and I got permission from our parents to take a road trip for our junior year spring break. We're both 16, and I'm the only one of us who can drive. It was late March, so there was still snow on the ground when we left. We drove from Madison, Wisconsin to a small town called Clifton Forge, Virginia. It's on the edge of West Virginia and Virginia. We went there for the Appalachian vibe, hoping to maybe see some cryptids. My best friend Eliza and I have always been huge horror and paranormal fans, and we've been in many scary situations before, but nothing like this. I don't know if you've heard much about cryptids in Appalachia, but we were excited to go since it seems to be a hotspot for sightings. Since I was the only one driving and could only handle about 7 hours straight, we stopped in Ohio for the night. The next morning, we drove from Ohio into the middle of nowhere, Virginia, deep in the mountains. We arrived at the cabin without any issues and spent the day having fun. The next morning, we decided to take a day trip to Washington, D.C. It was about a 3-hour drive, which is long for a day trip, but we figured why not. We left early and drove there without any trouble. We spent the whole day in D.C., and our last stop was at a mall. By then, it was already around 9 p.m. and dark out, but we still had a 3.5-hour drive ahead of us. About an hour into the drive back, we stopped at a Walmart to grab some snacks, use the bathroom, and take a break. When we got back to my car, which was a very cheap 2003 Toyota, I decided the drive back had been too boring. I put the cabin's address into Google Maps, and it showed 2 different routes. The one we were already on, which went through a valley, and another one that cut through the mountains. In my mind, I just thought it was a different freeway, a more scenic route, but I was very wrong. Off we went back on the road. We were driving on the highway when Google Maps told me to take an exit, so I followed it. It took us through a cute small town, and then it told me to take a turn onto a different road at the end of town. Once we turned down that road, it was completely dark, except for my weak headlights, which were barely lighting up the road and just touching the trees. I don't know what I was expecting when I chose the scenic route, but here we were. Google Maps said to continue on this road for 60 miles. Eliza and I just looked at each other and sighed. As I said before, we're both huge horror fans, but this was real. We were far from home in the mountains at night. About every 15 minutes or so, we would see a car driving in the opposite direction, but no one was behind us. Every 30 minutes or so, we'd pass through a small town, but other than that, it was just straight forest. I tend to fill up my tank when it gets down to around 100 miles left, because I'm scared of breaking down in the middle of nowhere. So when we reached another small town, we found a gas station and stopped to fill up. By this point, it was about 11 p.m., and we still had an hour ahead of us. When we pulled up, it was one of those gas stations that hadn't been updated since probably the 1980s. We glanced at each other, and I nudged Eliza, hoping she would get out first, but she didn't. I looked around once, and then stepped out, and Eliza followed me. It was eerily quiet, especially for being in the middle of the forest. Since we were 2 broke 16-year-olds, we went inside to pay with cash, and surprisingly, the station was still open. We walked inside, and were greeted by a creepy man, probably about 300 pounds. I walked up to the counter and asked for $20 worth of gas. He didn't say anything, so I held out the $20 bill and smiled at him. He stared back at me and made this creepy laugh or maybe a groaning noise. Then he asked how old we were and where we were from. We lied, saying we were 19 and from around the area. He laughed again and mumbled something about 2 pretty girls all by themselves. Eliza and I just glanced at each other and gave an awkward laugh. He laughed one more time and said we were all set. As I was pumping the gas, I noticed the man was standing at the window staring at us. We finally got back in the car and hit the road again, brushing off the creepy guy. About 3 minutes later, the road turned from the small town back into the forest. Not long after that, we saw a pickup truck pulled over on the side of the road. Its lights were off. Eliza and I looked at each other, and I sped past, maybe just out of paranoia. About a minute later, something huge flew past my window. We both turned our heads to look. When we looked back at the road, I had to slam on the brakes. There were 3 orange construction cones blocking the rest of the road. I came to a complete stop and started looking around frantically. We were both shaking, and we were confused. There weren't any signs warning of construction. Eliza told me to try going around, but the cones were blocking the whole road, and I didn't want to get in trouble if it really was a construction zone. Just then, we saw a figure walking through the woods on Eliza's side. It was getting closer, and then it stepped into the range of my headlights. It was a man, and he was carrying what looked like a brick. Then another man came up to my window and knocked on it. I looked up and screamed. I inched the car forward, while Eliza and I tried to figure out what to do. The man by Eliza's window also had a brick, and he started raising his hand like he was going to smash the window. I floored it. I didn't even care if my car took some small damage from the cones. We weren't going to stick around to find out what was about to happen. A few minutes later, I noticed a pair of headlights fast approaching behind us. I sped up, but they kept pace. They were tailing us. They followed us for about 20 minutes, until we reached another small town. They finally turned down a different road. I don't know if it was the same truck we saw earlier, or just a strange coincidence, but I think they realized we weren't stopping anytime soon. I don't know what they wanted, probably to rob us, and hopefully nothing worse. Thank God we didn't stick around to find out. Eventually, Google Maps directed us back onto the highway, and we were relieved to see other cars around us again. We made it back to the cabin safely and hurried inside. Everything was fine, but I had a hard time falling asleep. Maybe it was real, or maybe it was just my paranoia, but I swear I heard footsteps around the cabin that night. The next morning came, and all was well. A few days later, we went back to the area where the gas station was, just out of curiosity. Everything was normal, and the town was busy. Looking back on it now, I'm glad I did what I did. It was definitely an experience to tell.